Over the years, I've amassed hundreds if not thousands of games for around 15 or so consoles, as well as a ton on PC. Many of them are hard, but most of them are plenty beatable with enough patience. However, as far as I can recollect, none of the games I have ever wound up with will ever give me as hard a time as Bloodborne did. Bloodborne is largely thought to be a Souls-like game, and indeed it is on a fundamental level, but once you get into it, you will quickly see a fast, more ferocious game than what you would get in Dark Souls. At least, that's how it feels to me. For this, many From Software fans consider it to be their favorite from the studio, as it is more offense-focused than the defensive Souls games. This, to me, seemed like a reason that it would actually be easier, as I'm terrible at dodging and blocking in most games. But I was sadly and gravely mistaken. From the first few battles in the alleyways of the very beginning of the game all the way to the final fight with Gehrman, I struggled to get by, replaying every fight over and over until I either got through it or became exhausted and started playing something else, only to eventually be drawn back into the game eventually, of course, because I just can't let unfinished business sit there like that forever. Something about the way Bloodborne's enemies telegraph their moves isn't nearly as illuminating as it is in Dark Souls games. It's hard to put my finger on it, but perhaps the contrast between the enemies and the backgrounds made it easier to see what they were going to do. I'm honestly not sure, but learning the enemy moves in Bloodborne was always difficult for me for whatever reason. This led to more unnecessary hits being taken by me, which led to more deaths, which led to the lifespan of my controller being shortened significantly by the death grip I had it in for hours at a time. One area where Bloodborne always baited me was in the health regeneration during a fight. For those that don't know, if you lose a chunk of health, the game generally gives you a shot to get some, if not all of it back, if you are willing to get a few good hits in quick succession. This is often something my mind immediately went to, as I, of course, would want to regain some health. Why not? However, as the regeneration of some health is alluring, the act of rushing in to get some cheap shots is exactly against the way you should play Bloodborne, and can easily lead you to taking even more damage if you aren't exceedingly careful about it. I would fall into this trap often, and only got good at tampering down my urge to mindlessly take a few swings at the opposing enemy for some health towards the end of the game. However, thankfully by that time I had gotten good enough at the game to not get hit very often anyway. Easily the hardest parts of the game for me were the early bosses, as they were the initial tests of how well I was understanding the combat, and as such I would fail these tests miserably and repeatedly. Father Gascoigne, in particular, was a major source of frustration for me, as his attacks were fast, his firearm was powerful, and he was an all-around test of the various ins and outs of the combat that I just hadn't quite gotten my head around by the time I ran into him. On top of that, his transformation into his beast form turned the tables on me completely, just when I thought I was getting the hang of him. All in all, while I did get quite a bit of trouble from him, and considered rage deleting the game several times, I persevered. And I'll be damned if I didn't slay the hell out of him once it all clicked. The key for me at this point was realizing that my firearm was a good way to stun him. Even if he only stayed in that state for a very short moment, it was enough to get a few attacks in and get away from him until I saw another chance to do that again. On top of that, I also realized that once he was in his beast form, despite him being much more imposing and crazy looking, he was actually a bit easier, I think. His attacks were clearly more powerful, but they also had way more obvious tells that gave me a good chance to shoot my firearm, break those attacks, while also giving me a moment to give him one full combo of hits that he couldn't interrupt in this form. To me, that made him a little easier, and also gave me one of Bloodborne's most important lessons. Breaking an enemy's move and following that up with a string of hits is your best friend. It's not something easily done in every situation, but it did serve as a good default strategy for most situations. I would modify the concept here and there to fit various bosses and enemies' attack patterns, but basically once I realized how to pull that off, beating the game suddenly wasn't such a far-fetched idea. Trudging through the rest of the game was no easy task though. I still came across my fair share of hardships. Martyr Ligarius was one of those hardships. Again, Like most of my challenges with From Software games, it was more of a case of me not adjusting my tactics well enough to suit the situation than it was anything else, as I continuously tried to take him out with heavy weapons, since I just generally enjoy heavier weapons in action games. This, however, was a mistake on my part. You've got to be willing to go outside of your comfort zone in games like this. At the point where I came across Ligarius, I had not fully understood this yet. The boom hammer and hunter axe will just not do for this boss, at least not in my experience. Also, given his tendency to use magic and projectiles, you'd think I would just get closer to him, but as I am a stubborn old man, I tried to just keep even further away from him and only come in for cheap shots every now and then. This would make fights long and ultimately fruitless. Eventually, once I was tired enough of dying, but still too far into the game to quit and rage delete it, I decided, screw it, let's just do the opposite of what I've been doing and see what happens. As such, going in close with lighter weapons and being more aggressive did the trick. This taught me another valuable lesson of the game. Don't get too comfortable with any one attack style. Most action-adventure games I've played are forgiving enough for me to stick with whatever heavy blade or axe that I want and still give me a viable path onward, but Bloodborne don't play that. You have to adapt. On top of several bosses giving me a learning curve that felt extremely steep for me in Bloodborne, and an upgrade system that also took me a little while to figure out, I eventually got my head around it all and got through it. I'm glad I did, as the satisfaction of doing so was a great feeling that few games have matched. However, the speed of the combat mixed with the high amount of difficulty and risk in every fight solidly puts this game in the #1 spot in my library as the hardest game I own. That's it for this video. If you enjoyed and would like to see more, feel free to hit that subscribe button and hit the notification bell to ensure you'll be notified when new videos go up.